So thank you very much for joining us on this De Morgan online talk. It's great to see so many of you with us today live, and I hope for people watching this as a catch-up session, you enjoy the session too. If you are watching live, then please feel free to use the chat box in Zoom to be able to ask questions to our speaker, or for me to help you with anything technical as the talk's going on. There will be time for questions at the end, so we will save those until the end of today's talk, and I'll be able to put those questions to Darcy. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Darcy Brown is an enthusiast of vintage and historically inspired clothing, in particular Victorian and Edwardian. She studied the Pre-Raphaelites and their associates during a history degree at the University of Hull, from which she graduated with a first-class BA honours in 2021. This talk is based on her research for an undergraduate dissertation, The Influence of Pre-Raphaelitism and the Aesthetic Movement on Women's Alternative Dress, 1850 to 1900. Darcy is also one of the volunteers at the De Morgan Foundation Museum at Cannon Hall in her hometown of Barnsley. Darcy, I'm so pleased that you've been able to join us to give us this talk today, and it's my pleasure to hand over to you. Enjoy, and I'll see you at the end for some questions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining in with this. So our topic today, as Sarah has said, is going to be the Victorian origins of alternative fashion, and we're going to have a specific focus on Evelyn de Morgan's paintings. So to set the scene, the Victorian era, strictly speaking, was 1837 to 1901, when Victoria passed away, Queen Victoria. And so what I've done here, just to establish kind of the general topic, is given you a fashion plate from the years 1837 and 1901. So these are in particular evening dress. So this is what, if you were wealthy at least, and able to follow fashion, this is what you would have been aspiring to look like if you were going to a ball, for example. So I'm sure I don't need to really point out to you the incredible difference in between these two fashion plates. For instance, in 1837, we can see that the skirt was very wide, helped by layers upon layers of petticoats to achieve that stiff shape. Whereas in 1901, the figure overall, the silhouette, is kind of a bit more slender, but we have a bit of a bell shape going on where the skirt at the bottom is a bit like a fishtail. We can also see differences in things such as hairstyles, accessories, etc., just to demonstrate really how the entire look had developed in those 65 years of Victoria's reign. So just to be a bit more precise about what happened in between those years, we have an example from the 1860s, which shows dresses supported by a structure called the crinoline. We'll see a picture of that in a moment. In the 1870s, got to say it's not one of my favourite looks whatsoever. I think it's pretty atrocious, to be honest, pretty hideous. But this kind of silhouette was achieved with a bustle, which again we'll see in a minute. And finally, the 1890s, one of my personal favourites. I love the kind of silhouette of the big leg of mutton sleeves and the wide skirt, but also kind of to balance it out, quite a slender waist, achieved, of course, through corsetry. So here I've provided some examples of the kind of items that if you were wealthy Victorian woman, that you would have to help you achieve the fashionable silhouette. I must say the Queen herself didn't actually follow fashion as such, because it was seen as basically not appropriate for Queen Victoria to keep track of fashion so closely, because she was the Queen. She had far more important things to worry about. However, if you were a member of the upper middle class or the aristocracy, these are the kinds of things that you would have in your wardrobe. So in the 1860s, the cage crinoline was predominant. This had actually been first introduced in 1856, to be precise. That's when the design for it was patented. Before that, as I mentioned previously, layers upon layers of petticoats would have been used to stiffen out a skirt. this was kind of revolutionary, that it eliminated the necessity for doing that. And so if you were able to own one of these things, it kind of assisted you in that way. Then we have the crinolet, which is kind of the bridge between the cage crinoline and the bustle. This, we'll see an example in the next slide. This basically puffed out the skirt at the back, but less so at the sides. And then we've got two different varieties of the bustle. The bustle was basically just something that allowed you to achieve kind of a weird shelf thing at the back, just to drape all your numerous fabrics over. The first example is more like a bit of a cushion. It's made of horsehair fabric, for instance. The second example is a cage, and I don't know about you, but I wouldn't fancy trying to sit down in that. Eventually, it was made sort of collapsible to allow people to sit down easier. But one of the horror stories that I've come across researching the bustle is that apparently in 1887, to mark Victoria's Golden Jubilee, they released a limited edition bustle, which every time a woman sat down, it would play God Save the Queen. So I'm sure you can agree that's horrendous. And then finally, we've got a corset, an example from 1890 roughly. And we'll see again in a bit that the corset itself developed so much throughout history and throughout the Victorian era itself. The corset essentially was an absolute necessity, not just for the upper classes, not just for the respectable women, but for working class women as well, because the corset was essentially like a bra, because bras didn't exist. It was a support garment. It also provided structure and allowed you to achieve fashionable silhouettes. If you did not wear a corset, as we will see, you were seen essentially as a bit of a loose woman, someone who was not to be trusted because you were not sort of keeping yourself respectable by wearing one. So here we've got some specific examples of some actual ensembles that women would have worn, the kind of things. So beginning in the earlier Victorian era, we've got an example of a day dress. So as you can see here, the skirt is a little bit puffed out, but it's not exactly too much exaggerated. And then we have an example of an evening dress from about 1869. This has the crinolet to help it achieve that shape. So basically it's kind of a nice half kind of bustle thing. And then we have an 1870s afternoon dress. You can see here that the bustle started to come into fashion. Then we have what I'm not entirely certain, but I would guess is a morning dress. And that's from about 1880. So we can see the bustle is still in use, but it's changed slightly so that the sort of hump thing is more exaggerated. And then finally, an example of an afternoon dress from 1895. I think it looks a bit like a lobster, I must say, but I'm also wearing red, so I can't really comment on that too much. And I think I briefly mentioned earlier, a big fashion trend of the 1890s was what we call the leg of mutton sleeve, or gigot in French, which means leg of mutton. And that's because it looks like a leg of mutton. So again, just to exaggerate, highlight how kind of ridiculous the bustle in particular could be throughout the 2 decades that it was fashionable. So in 1873, we've got kind of an odd shape where the poor woman looks a bit like she can barely keep herself upright because it's probably adding so much weight to her backside. 1878, it's still there a little bit, but it's slimmed down quite a lot. And finally, in 1887, she might as well just have a tea tray on the back of her because it's that big. And it's, as I have put before, I think it's frankly hideous, but there we go. So here I've included Alexandra, who was the daughter-in-law of Queen Victoria and the Queen consort of Edward VII when he became king. I've included her because it's a bit interesting, as she, for the Victorians, was a bit like what Kate Middleton or the late Princess of Wales, Princess Diana, was, like a fashion icon, essentially. So we can see here her on her wedding day in 1862, and then an example of her wearing a very structured bodice achieved through corsetry in 1889. And finally, she's wearing a dress with a very slight bustle, but a lot of, it's got a train on it, like you have in quite a lot of wedding dresses today, circa 1878. So she was a fashion icon, especially when she started to wear high necks. And that's apparently because she had a scar on her neck. So gradually the high neck started to be imitated by a lot of women who saw her as a fashion icon. More ridiculous, though, was the fact that she developed an injury after her 6th pregnancy, in which she developed a limp. And so people started to realize that she walked with a limp. And then many women would deliberately fake a limp and use a walking stick just to imitate her. So like I said, a bit like kind of Kate Middleton is, as soon as she appears in something that people admire, it sells out on whatever website. It's the equivalent of that, essentially. So we've introduced mainstream fashion for the Victorian woman, but of course it did have quite a number of issues. Firstly, hygiene. I'm going to introduce this problem to you with a very random list of items, and I'm going to actually think about what this list can reveal to us about the issues of floor-length clothing in city streets. I think this list was specific to somewhere in London, well into the 1890s, so the final decade of the Victorian era. So our lovely random list here includes 2 cigar ends, 9 cigarettes, a portion of pork pie, 4 toothpicks, 2 hairpins, a stem of a clay pipe, 3 fragments of orange peel, a slice of cat's meat, which was horse meat, by the way, half a sole of a boot, 1 plug of tobacco chewed, and finally straw, mud, scraps of paper, and miscellaneous street refuse. Now, I'm going to guess that maybe if I didn't tell you where this list of stuff was found, you might think, oh, it might have been found on a street corner, it might be found in a doorway, something like that. This was actually, all of this stuff had been swept up by a lady's dress with a fashionable train in the 1890s. And so she'd basically dragged all of this stuff along with her as she walked along the street and then deposited it as she was climbing into her carriage. So I think the reason why I included this is that it kind of perfectly represents why long skirts was such a problem in Victorian cities. So I've included examples here of the sort of dress that might have caused such an issue. So as we can see, varying lengths of train here, but nonetheless, if you were walking along a city street and all that stuff happened to just be lying around, it would be unlikely that you wouldn't be sweeping all of that along with you. So next, another kind of major issue really, impracticality. So one of these is certainly an exaggerated cartoon. It's the central image. This, I saw a bit of a joke about this actually. So it said that we could have done with these huge crinolines during the pandemic because you cannot but social distance if you're wearing that. So that was just a cartoon. It's probably in the popular satirical publication Punch. I think that's where it's from. Just kind of poking fun at the crinoline because when it got bigger, it shrunk a bit, but this was never this extreme. But obviously when a fashion becomes kind of seen as ridiculous, then people do poke fun at it. And so the image on the right is an actress, Ellen Terry. She was a stage actress in a lot of Shakespearean productions, and she actually hated mainstream fashion. She herself didn't follow it, and she thought that women, especially with the fashion achieved through the bustle, like on the picture on the left, she thought they looked like walking upholstery, and I think I would have to agree with her on that. So finally, the issue of corsets. And you might have noticed that I've put issue in inverted commas, because I'm not a fan of corset bashing whatsoever. I own corsets, I wear them, I find them very comfortable, very supportive, providing they fit you correctly. However, to this day, there is a myth that persists, as it was back when corsets were an essential item, that corsets can, in extreme cases, kill you. So for instance, when I was looking into attitudes towards the corset today, I found the quote from an alternative lifestyle website that says, "Stomachs and other vital organs would literally be dislodged from their normal resting places, causing serious health problems and in some cases death." Okay then. So, I already just think that's absolutely ridiculous. As I said, at the time, and still today, there is a misconception that the corset could literally crush everything inside you if it was laced too tightly, and that's the opposite thing. If it was laced too tightly, that's not exactly healthy. I will agree with that. However, corsets, they were honestly just support garments. They were just something to give you that fashionable shape if you could afford to do so. If not, as a working woman, they would just provide you support with the rest of the outfit. And another thing, if these things were so dangerous, how did women survive? Like, if everyone was wearing them pretty much, nobody would have survived. So I just think that this is a bit of ridiculous propaganda. Anyway, to demonstrate how people thought about it at the time itself, Mary Eliza Howarth, who wrote a couple of very hilarious kind of advice books about how to dress properly, how to decorate a house properly, how to behave. This example from her book, The Art of Beauty, in 1878, what she has to say about corsets is this: "The mischievous person who first brought in stays, which is another name for corset, is to blame for the first and greatest defect of modern appearance, the grotesque outline of the body and many a dire disease." But just for context here, it was actually believed that corsets could give you lung disease. And then she goes on to say, "We are not denying the necessity for some close-fitting garment to support the body and an improvement to the figure. People who refuse to wear any corset at all look very slovenly." So we see here that she's almost a bit conflicted. She hates the way that it sort of deforms the natural shape of the body, which was another issue that people had with the corset. But she also admits that if people were to suddenly abandon them, that just simply wouldn't be appropriate or acceptable in her eyes, or in many other people's eyes at the time. So this leads us on to a movement called dress reform, which tried to give women an alternative way of dressing in response to all the criticism that the corset, the bustle, the crinoline received. So here I've said it's killing two birds with one stone, and that's because it's this particular example of a woolen corset was thought to be more hygienic because wool is a natural fibre, it's more breathable than synthetic fibres. And also this was not as heavily boned. So traditional corsets were boned with whalebone to give it that structure. This was very lightly boned with just kind of stiff fabric. So it was seen to be a bit kinder to the body, not as, because corsets, like I said, if you do wear them incorrectly, if you lace them too tight, not the most comfortable. They won't kill you, but they're not the most comfortable. So the idea behind this was to provide women an alternative and allow them to still be fashionable and respectable. So the next kind of chapter, if you like, of the presentation, now we're going to look at when art meets fashion. So we're going to focus on Pre-Raphaelitism and the aesthetic movement. So just to introduce what Pre-Raphaelitism was, a lot of you might know already, but those who don't, it was essentially a very rebellious art movement actually at the time. So it started with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in 1848, which consisted of 7 very young men, most of them in their late teens. 3 of those men are the most studied, the most famous, and that is John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and William Holman Hunt. They wanted to basically give everyone a new, revived way of painting that looked back to the art before the Renaissance master Raphael, hence the name. They were fed up of seeing kind of perfectly polished academic paintings, and they just wanted to get back to painting from nature, painting, from what you saw outside, and just kind of being more intensely realistic in painting. So this example is one of the group's very first major paintings, John Everett Millais' Isabella. You can see here that a lot of the clothes, a lot of the outfits are very medieval, and that's because the setting itself is medieval. But if we then look at another example from a different Pre-Raphaelite, William Holman Hunt, again, he's gone for kind of a Elizabethan, Shakespearean kind of, it's very nostalgic because these were men, working in the Victorian era, centuries after these fashions portrayed here were in fashion themselves. So that's an example from 1851. And then, strictly speaking, this cannot be called Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood kind of era work, because the Brotherhood by this time had kind of separated, they'd all gone their separate ways. But Dante Gabriel Rossetti, again, in his painting The Tune of the Seven Towers, decided to give his models like a medieval costumes. And so fashion historians now know that the Pre-Raphaelites definitely did research fashion history from medieval Renaissance periods, because they used a book by a French author, Camille Bonnard, Costume Historique. And so in the late 1840s, Millais and other members were using this book to actively research appropriate historical costume that they could put into their paintings. Again, it was their effort to kind of be more truthful, be more realistic in their paintings, instead of just like inventing whatever costume they wanted to put in. We don't think that these sketches in this book were exactly historically accurate, probably not, but for them, they thought it was. And so we've got to kind of admire that they were going out of their way to research historical costume in order to accurately as they could represent that in their paintings. So this moves on to a new style of dressing that came to be known as Pre-Raphaelite dress. And that's because due to the Pre-Raphaelite artists deciding to give people in the go back to the medieval age, some women who wanted to be a bit more experimental with fashion instead of just following, what the actual mainstream fashion was, some women started to dress in a bit of a similar way to what they were seeing in these paintings. So, for instance, on the right, Elizabeth Siddal, she ended up being Dante Gabriel Rossetti's wife, and she herself was an artist. In this drawing by Rossetti himself, we can see that she's wearing something that at the time would have been seen quite inappropriate, because for one thing, it's loose fitting. We can see from just looking at it that she ain't wearing a corset underneath that. She's also not wearing any kind of, we don't think she's wearing any structure on the skirt either, because we can see her knees. It sounds ridiculous, but if you were a fashionable Victorian woman, you wouldn't be able to see the knees, because there would have been something between the knees and the skirt. And then on the left, we've got William Morris's wife. He himself sketched this of her. He's more known for his textiles, but he did other things as well. So he sketched her in the costume of Helen of Troy. We think he also probably used costume historique as well. So we can see here that some women who were married to artists, were artists themselves, had an interest in dressing a bit differently. And we think that one of the main reasons for that is that to dress in this way would have been quite a lot more practical for artistic women, because it did provide you a bit more ease of movement and also self-expression if you were brave enough in the Victorian era to kind of go against the status quo and dress however you wanted. It was quite a very brave thing to do, really. So to introduce something known as the aesthetic movement, I've decided to include a painting known as A Private View at the Royal Academy by William Powell Frith. This was done in 1883. So he decided to paint the annual summer exhibition of the Royal Academy, which usually took place around May. And I've put these particular people in these boxes to demonstrate that they are wearing something that's quite different from the rest of the people in the painting. If you look at the group of two ladies and a little girl on the left, you can see that they're wearing outfits that are very earthy in colour. So we've got kind of like an ochre, like a rosy pink and a green. And this is because one of the attractions, if you like, of alternative fashion was that it's often based around earthy colours, things that would remind you of the natural world instead of synthetic dyes, because synthetic dyes started to come in the late 1860s. The issue with that, which we can identify now, but they wouldn't have really identified at the time, is that a lot of those dyes contained arsenic. So that means if you sweated or if some rain water got onto it, that arsenic would leak into your skin. So these women were actually, without really realizing it at the time, dressing quite a lot safer as well than the mainstream fashion. And again, towards the right, there's another lady who's wearing like a coral salmon pink kind of dress. We can see here that it's got a lot of drapery going on. So again, it's got a train, so you can't exactly say that it was more hygienic. But the general kind of shape to it is a lot different than, for instance, the lady in deep purple who is on that lady's right, because she's wearing the conventional fashion of the day. And then the male figure whose head I've put in the little box, those of you who are keen-eyed will probably recognize this man as Oscar Wilde. So we think that the artist deliberately put Oscar Wilde in this painting, giving him like a role of, you know, probably giving these people gathered around him a tour or something of the exhibition. And that was because, as we will see, Oscar Wilde was a huge proponent of the aesthetic movement. He himself ended up dressing quite distinctively from other men at the time. So he didn't really wear kind of long trousers. He kind of it veered more towards breeches, towards, again, like a more historically inspired for the Victorians kind of way of dressing. So another artist I'm going to introduce, we're going to have a focus on him for a minute, is James Abbott McNeill Whistler. If you're not familiar with him, you might be familiar with him based on his famous painting, which is more commonly known as Whistler's Mother. It's one of the most famous American paintings. It formed the plot of a Mr. Bean film wherein this painting got damaged. But anyway, Whistler spent a lot of his career in the UK, even though he was originally American, and he became one of the main artists to espouse the aesthetic movement. So as you can see, his 3 paintings here, which were all called Symphony in White. Whistler's kind of trademark essentially was to give his paintings a name which reflected music. It was just one of his signatures. So he called each one of these, which were painted respectively in 1862, 1864, and 1865 to 67. and he called it Symphony in White number 1, Symphony in White number 2, Symphony in White number 3. And you can see here that the focus, well, I think at least, the focus is on the dresses. So even though we've got lots of decorative items in the background, we've got vases, flowers, fans, we've got a dead wolf on the floor in one of them. That white dress, which provides quite a stark contrast to the rest of the paint, the rest of the scene, the background, is what draws us in to look at that. And that's because the idea behind painting these was to make us, without giving us like a complex meaning or a complex story behind these paintings, he and his associates, his fellow aesthetic artists, simply wanted us to admire the paintings for how beautiful they were. So another example here, this is by a female artist, Louise Jopling, blue and white. Again, we've got, you know, a lot of decorative items in the background, but the main focus is the lovely, simplistic, kind of classically inspired white dresses of these two women. And so this, I would think, could be classed as a genre painting because it's essentially two women washing at home, what we assume to be someone's home. And so it's just incredibly simple and just quite pretty and quite, it's very undemanding. Aesthetic works, one of their appeal is that they don't demand you to decode everything in the painting. There's no real symbolism in there. There's no real kind of story that you have to try and figure out. That was part of the appeal of them, and I think it still is. So this leads me on to talk about a trend, a 19th century trend that was known as Japanisme. This came from basically a frenzy that came about after Japan was forced to reopen itself for trade with the West, the Western nations, especially France. So this was a bit of an obsession that occurred as a result of that, whereby Japanese art became very sought after, highly admired and imitated. So again, Whistler, he was someone who was very interested in this. And so he painted The Princess from the Land of Porcelain in the 1860s, which you can just instantly see that that's certainly Japanese inspired, because she's wearing something similar to a kimono, and she's also got a lovely Japanese fan screen behind her and that kind of blue and white rug as well. And then in the Japanese dress, a bit later in the 1870s, again we can see this subject. She's wearing a kimono, she's got a parasol, and so it's kind of a Western imitation of traditional Japanese clothes, essentially. So here, again, Whistler, we can see he was especially obsessed with this trend. And this portrait, which he made of the wife of one of his major patrons in the 1870s, you can see that the focus here is essentially her showing off her dress to the viewer. And again, it's gone with the musical theme of calling this Symphony in Flesh, Colour and Pink. I've included on the left a traditional Japanese woodblock print to just demonstrate to you that this kind of posture, he must have got this from looking at woodblock prints himself, from studying them and from trying to emulate that. Because essentially, Japanisme was all about looking at traditional Japanese art, but then adapting it to kind of the Western art market, essentially. So here we have a tea gown that was circulated in Britain, but it was actually made in Japan, and it was made around 1898. So we can see that then, because trade with Japan opened in the late 1850s, we can see 4 decades after, it was still relevant to kind of try and emulate Japanese tastes in not only painting but fashion as well. So now we come on to two figures who we've already met, and then we're going to meet someone else in a minute as well. On the left, we have Ellen Terry again, the lady who said that women looked like walking upholstery. She was known to basically herself wear quite different clothing to other women of the Victorian era. So you can see here that what she's wearing, again, it's quite roomy. There's a bit of a sack back going on. The sack back, or the watteau pleat, is a throwback to the 18th century, when having that kind of excess fabric on the back of a dress was fashionable. So she's wearing a bit of a throwback to that. And then Oscar Wilde in the middle, as I mentioned earlier, he was a huge proponent of the aesthetic movement, of re-establishing what painting should look like, what fashion should look like. He was also an art critic, obviously he was a poet, playwright as well. And so his relevance, because unfortunately a lot of you might know that at the time Oscar Wilde lived, it was much less acceptable to have a different sexual identity from the norm. And so unfortunately, he's most known today for being put on trial in 1895 and then being sentenced to hard labour, all because he loved men. And so at the time, his reputation was unfortunately tainted by that. And then finally on the right, we have a woman called Rosalind Howard. She was married to George Howard, the 9th Earl of Carlisle. They lived in Castle Howard in North Yorkshire. She's another person who was noted at the time for dressing quite visibly different from everyone else. Someone actually who visited them at Castle Howard, I don't know, I can't remember who it was, but they actually remarked on her dressing madly in all these strange colours and strange dresses. And someone even invented a word and said that she was unbecrinoline. We've got a painting that was done of Rosalind Howard, showing instantly that her style of dressing was, again, quite a bit of a throwback to, I would say, about Renaissance times, so kind of 15th century, 16th century. She's gone for a brown, which is, again, quite an earthy colour, quite different from the garish blues and purples that would have been trendy at this time, even though we're not sure of the date. We know that for most of the Victorian period, big, bold patterns and bright colours were predominant in fashion. So here we've got Jane Morris again, the wife of William Morris, and a lot of fashion historians are debating whether this was, in fact, the first fashion shoot achieved through what was then still quite a relatively new art medium of photography. So the person he didn't take the photographs were taken by John Parsons, I think, but the person who basically instructed Jane on how to pose, etc., was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and that's because it's now known that the two of them had an affair going on, unfortunately for William Morris. So in 1865, this series of photographs, and there's way more as well if you're interested in Googling them, they show that Jane, another person who was interested in wearing garments that were visibly unsupported, should we say, by anything such as a corset, a crinoline, a bustle, etc. And so again, Jane Morris was artistic herself. She was a master embroiderer. So we think that, we don't know for certain, but if she was dressing like this in her daily life, as well as, for a photo shoot, that was probably because she wanted an option that was more practical. However, what's difficult is we can't always know. She might have indeed followed mainstream fashion just to fit in, because this is indeed deliberately staged. It's a posed photo shoot, if you like. So now we can come on to a bit of fun. Of course, whenever anything new comes along, one of the usual responses is to make fun of that. So ridiculing the aesthetes, I'm still not quite sure how to say that. an aesthete was essentially someone who followed the aesthetic movement, who wanted to live their life as if they were in a painting. So
Darcy,
yeah,
it's Sarah. Can you repeat what you said on that last slide? We lost your sound there ever so slightly.
yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. Yes, ridiculing the aesthete. An aesthete was someone who essentially followed the aesthetic movement. These people were regarded at the time to essentially walk up to a painting and decide, oh, I want to look like that myself. And so they would try and dress in that way. They would try and behave in whatever way someone was shown to be behaving in a painting as such. And obviously, as is usually the case with anything quite new and radical, if you like, one of the responses to come out of that is to make fun of that. So firstly, one of the biggest criticisms of aesthetes was that they showed signs of melancholy, which was a Victorian era term for depression, essentially. So in 1881, Georges du Maurier did this cartoon of a woman of fashion, so a woman who dressed according to the mainstream of the time, and an aesthetic woman as well. What he's done here, though, as you will see, is he's depicted each one in turn as either favourable or unfavourable. So in the first kind of scene, if you like, the aesthete is the woman on the left who is made to look a bit droopy, rather slovenly, and very, very miserable. Whereas the woman next to her, she's got this kind of haughty air about her. She's probably looking down on that aesthetic woman because she probably thinks she looks ridiculous, to be honest. And then the next image, we have the woman of fashion who it's now her turn to look silly, essentially. So he's made it look as though her corset is sucking her in too much, that she's struggling to breathe probably, and that her clothes are quite ill-fitting, if you like. Whereas the aesthetic woman is made to look quite, well, more preferable, obviously. Like her clothes fit her quite well. She looks well groomed, and she looks a lot more comfortable, should we say. Another cartoon, I think this depicts someone who is probably self-centered, because it's called the six mark teapot, and that's because the woman in the cartoon is obviously quite enamored with this teapot. She's more interested in that than she is at the man, who might possibly be enamored with her, and he's wondering why she's paying so much attention to a teapot. But aesthetes was that they were so obsessed with items, with decorative things such as teapots, such as vases, such as fashion, that they, didn't care about anyone or anything around them. It was so absorbed in just having all these beautiful things surrounding them. Which then leads on nicely to the next cartoon, which depicts excess. So again, Georges du Maurier was the cartoonist, and this is basically a mother who has six girls, and one of her little girls is coming up to her and saying, "Why are you so upset?" And the woman broken her favourite china vase, so she's in absolute bits, and she doesn't care about her children because there's 6 of them, whereas there was only one of her most prized possession. And then finally, Oscar Wilde, who is a major criticism of him, and now we would probably see this as homophobia, was that he was effeminate. And that at the time was probably one of the worst things that you could be as a man, because as a man, as a Victorian man, you were supposed to be the sole provider for your household. You were supposed to be very masculine, stoic, not really show any emotion. But Oscar Wilde was seen as the opposite of that. And the reason why his head is in a sunflower is that sunflower essentially became a bit of an emblem of the aesthetic movement. So that's why they've kind of ridiculed him in such a way. And also I think there must be a bit of anti-Irish sentiment in this as well, because Oscar Wilde was born in Dublin, So that comes into it as well, unfortunately. So finally, the star of the show, really, this is the De Morgan Foundation. We're going to have a little bit of a closer look at now at fashion and costume in Evelyn De Morgan's artwork. So just to introduce Evelyn, if we don't know her already, she was born in 1855 and she died in 1919. She was married to William De Morgan, who was he was mostly ceramicist, but they were basically an artistic power couple of their day, both interested in feminism, both interested in spiritualism, and just generally making at the time that they lived. So I might be biased here, but I think that Evelyn De Morgan was exceptional at depicting the flow of fabrics in painting. I'm not an artist myself. I just look at paintings and make comments on it. But I can imagine it must be very difficult to be able to portray the actual movement and flow of fabrics in painting, but do that exceptionally well. So in Helen of Troy, she's managed to get this classical drapery to look like it's kind of flowing in the breeze. And then in this painting, Medea, which is of an evil sorceress, she's managed to get this heavy Renaissance style robe to look quite, I guess, a bit daunting in a way. So just to distinguish between fashion and costume, because there is kind of some crucial differences here. Fashion, you follow it or you don't. It's kind of, well, some women at the Victorian era didn't really have a choice. If they wanted to be taken seriously, then they had to follow it, and obviously providing they could afford to. Fashion is always subject to change, but it's cyclical. That's why we see trends come back over and over again over time. It can be seen as frivolous, but at the same time, it's scrutinized. It always has been and always will be on high profile wearers. And then it can also signify status and financial position. Costume can be pretty much anything you want it to be. It's usually a bit more fun and more do-it-yourself, more accessible to more people because those people have, you might not be able to afford fashion, you might not be able to afford that. So with costume, you can have fun with that. In paintings, fashionable clothing can actually help fashion historians identify the time period, whereas with costume, it's a bit more difficult because, as we've seen, you could be being painted in the Victorian era, but you might be wearing a medieval gown, so then it confuses matters a little bit. So Walter Crane made this sketch of two kind of different types of artistic dress. The first type on the left is classical, the second is medieval or Renaissance. So on that note, the first kind of major category of costume that we can see when we study Evelyn De Morgan's paintings is classical. So classical, the main characteristic of that is that it's quite draped, it's very roomy, sometimes it's a bit skimpy, but that's usually if an artist wants to portray a semi-nude, such as this painting, The Dryad. As we can see, a lot of the aesthetic paintings that we've seen so far have kind of taken classical drapery and adapted it for aesthetic garments, which one of their main benefits was ease of movement because they were unrestricted. And then some examples of medieval or Renaissance garments are here. We've got 3 paintings, and we can see again, these are quite roomy, quite, again, quite draped, but they seem to be more richly adorned. They seem to be more kind of heavier looking in that respect. So this one I think is a bit of an amalgamation of the two. We've got the drapery, we've also got kind of like the puffed sleeves and the jewelry, which make the costumes in this a bit of a blend between classical and medieval, because obviously, as I mentioned, with costume, you are a bit more free to be experimental with that. I've included these two here because I think it's interesting. We don't know if, Evelyn might not have seen this illustration, but in terms of using these earthy tones, again, it's a aesthetic clothes were meant to reference the natural world. I think it's interesting that these two, well, one of them is an illustration, one of them is a painting. They both depict clothing that, instead of having garishly bold colours, it's more toned down and reflective of flowers, of fruits, of natural items. So I've managed to find, this was quite hard, but I did it, some actual aesthetic garments and match those to some of Evelyn de Morgan's paintings. So here we have a Liberty & Co. They were a huge supplier of luxury fabrics in the Victorian era. This is one of their robes, golden robes, and I think it looks quite similar in style, and obviously both being gold, to this garment in the Gilded Cage. And then another example is in the painting The Hourglass, which the model is Jane Morris when she was a little bit older. This looks again quite similar to a Liberty & Co. tea gown that was a bit early. Again, we don't know if Evelyn had seen these garments or not, but I thought it was interesting just to give an idea of how some of her paintings did have some garments that looked quite aesthetic. And again, that's just to show you the back of that. And finally, we've got the painting The Prisoner. And so this, I think, is quite similar to another Liberty & Co. gown. It includes smocking, which, if you can see, is the detail around the waist. That's the traditional country craft of ruching up fabric. And if you notice on the woman in the painting, on her arm, she has a peacock feather. I've asked if that's intentional or not, because the peacock, a bit like the sunflower, became another emblem of the aesthetic movement. So I'm wondering if Evelyn intentionally added that as a bit of a nod to the aesthetic movement, if you like. So that's essentially it. Here I've included some, if you're interested, if you want to know more about fashion history, 3 YouTube accounts, which I highly recommend. And then we've also got Fashion History Timeline, which is an amazing resource for breaking down decade by decade fashion history. It goes right back to basically the Stone Age, right up to the modern day. And also Past Lives Finery, which have a lovely catalogue of fashion plates. So I would definitely recommend checking some of these out if you're interested in finding out more. And thank you so much for listening.
Hello, Darcy, thank you so much for that talk. What an incredible overview of Victorian fashion, and you know, how that came through in paintings and how that was inspired by Pre-Raphaelitism and also came to inspire Pre-Raphaelitism, as you showed us there with the Evelyn de Morgan paintings at the end of the talk. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you so much. I wonder if anyone does have any questions for Darcy that they'd like to pass on. Just got lots of thank yous coming through at the moment, Darcy. I don't know if you can see the chat box, but some people who come every week are saying, you know, that was so interesting. And quite honestly, and I've now been doing these online lunchtime lectures for maybe 2.5 years, and honestly, that was one of the most interesting ones. So I really did thoroughly enjoy it, and you taught me so much about De Morgan's paintings and allowed me to kind of place her costume within not only Pre-Raphaelitism, but to anchor it within popular culture as well, which has been incredibly helpful. So thank you very much. So I've had a question that's come through from Alison. She says, where are the 3 Liberty costumes? She used to look after the Liberty catalogues at the City of Westminster Archive Centre. That's really interesting, Alison. Thank you for letting us know that.
If I can remember correctly, because I had those images of those Liberty gowns on my laptop for quite a while since I was researching my dissertation. I think potentially at least 2 of those are in the V&A at the minute. If not those particular ones, there are definitely some that the V&A currently have, but I think I would have to have a check because I'm not quite sure where they currently are, but they are absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be really interesting to find that out. And I know you mentioned us that obviously it's unclear whether Evelyn de Morgan would have seen those exact pieces that you showed us on screen, but in the late 1880s, her husband William de Morgan had a studio shop that sold his ceramic wares, and it was across the road from Liberty on Great Marlborough Street. And we know that Evelyn de Morgan and he kind of held parties and exhibitions there and had open houses on Sunday, so she definitely knew about Liberty. And if she never went inside, which I doubt, because I think everybody probably popped into Liberty and Co at some point, she would have seen the costumes in the window. So very astute. I think we can safely say she would have seen clothing like that. Alison's followed up on her question and said probably the V&A, but the Museum of London also has some Liberty costumes, so that's a great tip if anybody wants to follow on. Estelle would like to know, Darcy, if you have a favourite costume in any of Evelyn de Morgan's paintings.
I think I would definitely say the one in the hourglass, because that one immediately, when I managed to find that Liberty gown that looked a lot like it, I just thought, wow, it's very reminiscent of that. I just love how, because essentially Evelyn had painstakingly painted on, you'd have to zoom in quite a lot and it'd be even more preferable to see it in person. She painstakingly painted pearls onto that, and so it's very highly embellished and very sumptuous and just very gorgeous and luxurious.
Yeah, it's an amazing picture to see in the flesh. And if anybody's listening from America, that picture is actually at Delaware Art Museum at the moment. So that's the place to see that one. But you can also have a look at it on Google Arts and Culture, which has a very good zoom function on it. So you can zoom right in to see the texture of that gown. But yeah, Darcy's right. Nothing really does it justice like seeing the piece in real life. Are there any more questions for Darcy as speaker today? And if not, then I will let everybody go. We've been here for an hour now, so I think that's a good point to stop and give Darcy a break from talking and just say thank you once again for such a really wonderful talk, and sort of picking up on something in Evelyn de Morgan's paintings that, to the best of my knowledge, has never been studied academically before. So a really great insight and a really encouraging way of sort of inspiring others to think about her paintings and see all these different aspects of it. Darcy, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for listening today, whether that's been in the live version or whether you're watching as a recording. Final shout out, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, you're coming through as LH on my Zoom, but you're off to Delaware Museum next week, so enjoy the exhibition and make sure you look out for the hourglass, and I'm sure that'll be a lot more interesting to you now you have all this additional information to be going on with. So thank you for going to the museums, whether you're in the UK or the US. Additional thanks to everybody again who's come today, and thank you so much to you, Darcy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.